Hi everyone, it's me, Jane, and I am here today to bring you a video that I've been promising for quite a while, and that is Watercolor 101. So if you've ever been interested in trying watercolor but not sure where to start, this is the video for you. I'm going to walk you through all of the tips and techniques that I know so that you at least have a starting point to start figuring out how to use watercolor for yourself. So let's start by talking about what watercolor is. Now, watercolor is one of the oldest forms of paint. It's quite a simple medium. It's essentially pigment, either natural or synthetic, that is suspended in a binder, typically something called gum arabic. Watercolor, like the name suggests, is water soluble, meaning it's very easy cleanup. Even if it dries completely, you can easily re-wet it. Because watercolor is water soluble and can be carried around quite easily in little pans like this, it's really easy to make paintings very quickly and on the fly. You can travel with watercolor much easier than you can with acrylic or oil. There's very little setup, there's very little cleanup. It's a very quick medium to use if you only have a small amount of time to paint. And likewise, if you have very little space with which to store materials, watercolor is a great option for that as well. Now, watercolor comes in lots and lots of different forms. First, we have the standard that I think most everyone is familiar with, and that is pan watercolors. So these are in a tin or some kind of a palette with a lid, and they come in these dry little cakes. You just add water and they reconstitute into paint. So here, I'll take a wet brush, and all of these are completely dry. Just grab one, and it takes it a second to reconstitute. Let's get a color that you'll be able to see. This copper color. Right onto your paper. The next type that you might be familiar with is tubes. So this has a consistency very similar to acrylic paint. See, squeeze it out. It's got a good amount of body. I like to leave it in these pans because then it dries and it essentially becomes one of these. But all of my paints did start in the tube. That wet paint that I put over here, I'm just gonna dunk right into that wet paint. I've got a pretty thick amount, so you can use watercolor straight out of the tube. Look at that, it's pretty opaque. Good amount of coverage, just like acrylic paint, really. Next, we have liquid watercolor, and these are really fun to use. They can be a little bit challenging, but they're fun. They've got a little eyedropper. You put a little drop right there. These are very, very concentrated. So I'm just gonna pick some of that up. See how vivid and full-bodied that color is. So those liquid watercolors are a lot of fun. And another form of watercolor is pencil, watercolor pencil. So these are kind of the best of both worlds as far as art materials. If you like to draw, you know, you can come in here and lay that down and do whatever your drawing is that you want to do. And then take a wet brush, this just has water on it, and wet that down. Another material very similar to watercolor that you've seen me use is gouache. Now, what gouache is, if you can see it right here, it looks like white watercolor, but it's opaque. It's not transparent like other watercolors. And gouache actually does come in a whole range of colors. You can get gouache in just about any color you can imagine. So I'm just going to take my wet brush, get some of that, and I'm going to lay it down. Let's see, is there anything dry? All of this is wet. We'll just kind of lay it down right there over top of that. As it dries, it will become a little bit more transparent, but you can also mix it with your colors so that paint is still pretty wet. I'm just going to mix in there, just like with acrylic paint. Now let's talk about the materials that you will need when getting ready to start painting in watercolor. And the most important thing next to the paint itself is the paper that you choose. You want to make sure that you get something that actually says watercolor. You want paper specifically made for watercolor. The brand really doesn't matter. I tend to buy these Canson pads because they're easily found where I live and they're a good price. They're not expensive, but for the price, it's a pretty good paper. So I like these Canson. I know some people swear only by Arches paper, but just get whatever you can find, whatever you can afford. Some things to look for though in watercolor paper, obviously watercolor, you want to make sure it's at least 140 pound. That has to do with the thickness of the paper. 90 pound is very thin. It's going to warp a lot as it gets wet. The heavier it is, you can get 300 pound paper. It's very thick. It doesn't warp as much. It's also much more expensive. 140 I find is a good kind of middle of the road weight to use. The next thing is when you're first starting out with watercolor, I would recommend getting cold press. Make sure that it says cold press. There's cold press and hot press. Cold press has a bit of a texture to it. Probably you can't see that here in the camera, but I think, oh there, yep, there, I think you can see the texture a little bit up here. So it has a little bit of a texture to it. Hot press is very smooth, and I find that for beginners, cold press is easier to use. Hot press, it leaves harder lines. So down the road, as you become more experienced, if you want to be able to do really fine detail, hot press may be what you want. But right now while you're learning, I think that cold press is going to be the easiest for you to use. So 140 pound cold press paper. It comes in notepads like this where it's glued along one edge up here at the top. You can get it in spiral notebooks, you can get loose sheets. What I really like are these little watercolor blocks. Now these blocks come in any size. This is the small size. You can get them in this size, you can get them larger, you can get them in a ton of different sizes. The reason I like the blocks is because as you paint on paper like this, it will start to warp a little bit. Sometimes I don't mind that, but as it warps, you can get paint that pools into certain, spots on the paper. The paper is glued down on all four sides. So if you see, these pages are all connected all the way around. So the paper doesn't warp as much as you paint on it. And then once it dries completely, I take it off. Now to get it off, I will show you this once we have one that's painted on. I take my palette knife. There's always one spot somewhere that doesn't have glue on it. On this one, it's right here on this corner. So you just put your palette knife in there and then it just easily pulls right off. It takes very little effort to get that off of there. So that's why I like these. If you can't find blocks or don't like that idea, you can get paper like this. Some people use like washi tape to tape it down to their work surface. Some people pre-stretch it, which I never do. So I can tell you it's a thing, but I can't tell you anything else. I know that they soak it in water for a long time and then they let it dry. And that supposedly makes it so it doesn't buckle as much when you paint on it. But I just prefer the blocks. Now you're gonna want a good selection of paintbrushes. And I just use the paintbrushes out of my line of brushes. So if you've purchased my brushes off of my website, that's exactly what I'm using to do watercolor with. And the great thing about watercolor is you don't have to dedicate your brushes. So I can use these on watercolor, and then I can turn around and use them on acrylic, and turn around and use them on watercolor again. So it's not like oil where you want to have brushes that are only used for oil. Now my brushes are synthetic, and a lot of times people do like to use natural, like sable on watercolor. So if you can see how this brush is kind of puffy and soft, it's got a little bit of a different shape. This is a brush that's specifically made for watercolor. They hold more water and paint than synthetics, but synthetic is perfectly fine to use. So don't feel like you have to run out and buy a bunch of different brushes. Just use what you have. Typically, I like to just use a selection of rounds and liners. I do have my large filbert that I like to do washes with, and then this little bright that I like to use to kind of flip to make little splatters. Another tool that I love to use with watercolor, and I'm going to show you how I do it, is palette knife. Palette knife is so much fun with watercolor, and you can get some incredible looks that you really can't get with a brush. And I'm going to show you how I use palette knife with watercolor. You want to make sure that you have some paper towels or a soft absorbent towel that's kind of lint-free to use with your watercolors. You want some palettes, which is what I have my paint in here, or you can get a butcher's tray like this. I have this, I use it rarely. Once in a great while I use it. Basically it's a tin tray that has a ceramic coating on it. Super easy to clean up. I just don't find that I typically need that much space. I like to use 2 water containers. So as you see here, I've got this one that is green and this one that's clear. This is my wash water. So as I'm painting, when I need to get color off, I wash it in the same bucket every time. And then I will wipe it on a paper towel and rinse it in this water. So as I go throughout the day, this water gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier. And this water at the end of the day might be just a little bit cloudy. Trust me that it doesn't take very much pigment in your water to affect your painting. So if I were to dip into this with my filbert to do a wash, I would have a green haze on my paper. So it's really important that you have a clean water. The next materials that I like to use are my mediums. Don't be afraid. I know whenever we start talking about mediums with acrylic or oil or anything, people kind of glaze over. They don't know what mediums they need or what mediums they should use. So I'm going to show you right now the 2 most important mediums. They're actually the same thing. I just like to keep them in different spray bottles. This is water, clean, clear water with nothing in it. I like these 2 different bottles because this one gives a very fine mist in a small area. And this one, I can get some like splattery droplets and it gives me a lot bigger of a spray. So that's why I keep 2 spray bottles of clean water. My next medium, I don't use it quite as much as water, but as far as mediums go, this is one of my most used ones. And this is just a little spray bottle of rubbing alcohol. Nothing fancy, just rubbing alcohol. And yes, I will show you exactly what it does. It's fun. This next one, I don't ever really use this and I don't know why. I need to start using it. I made this medium. It's just salt water. It's regular water with table salt in it. And I've seen where people like sprinkle salt on wet paint and it gives this really cool crystallized look once it dries. I've never been able to get that to work to where it didn't like rip up the paper. So I thought, I wonder if I put it in water, if I'll get an interesting look with it that way. So that's what this is, just salt water. This is the only medium that I that I have purchased. You can buy mediums for watercolor that do everything from give you texture effects to iridescence, making your paint thicker like impasto, everything. This is the only one I buy, and I don't use it very often, but it's called granulation medium, and I will show you exactly what granulation medium does. In short, it makes the paint kind of break up and clump so it looks a little bit gritty and sandy. It's a really fun technique. So that is everything you will need to get started painting with watercolor. It can all be got for pretty inexpensive. And once you have your paper, your brushes, your water, and your paint, it is time to get busy working on some techniques. So let's do that now. To get started painting, the first thing I do, as you can tell, my palettes are kind of messy. So when I'm ready to start painting every day, I usually do this part about an hour before I start painting. I take my Super Soaker spray bottle and I wet down my whole palette, the paints, the mixing parts, all of it. You don't want to make everything swim, all of your dry paints. You just want to wet them down so that that water can start to soak into the paints so that they're a little easier to use when you reach for them. That's why I do this about an hour before I start painting. It gives that water some time to soak into there. Then I usually take my paper towel left over from my last painting session and I wipe down all of the little mixing pots. And you'll probably see a lot of cat hair because Mr. Moon likes to help sometimes. So if there's cat hair in my paint palette, it's just because I have a really good helper. So I'm just gonna wipe all of these out. And then we are ready. Our palette is ready to be used. Now these palettes, real quick, I just want to show you, like I said, in the tubes, I buy the tubes, I squeeze them into here, and then on the back, I label them with the name of the paint. You can get palettes that have little cups that are removable so that you don't have to dig out the paint every time you want to add a new color, which I have to do. So if I bought a new red, I'd have to dig out everything and move everything down. But whatever works for you. When you're setting up your palette, it's important that you keep everything organized. So as you can tell here, I kind of have this little rainbow order. I've got my reds to oranges, yellows, greens, blues, and then it comes back to here to my purples, and then into my blacks and grays and browns. You don't have to set your palette up like this. You can set your palette up however you like. The important thing is, like I said, have some kind of an order that makes sense to you and keep everything in that order, because then it's easy to make decisions. You can remember, okay, these are my blacks and grays, these are my reds. It's just much easier, and it makes choosing a color much faster, and you can work much more spontaneously than if you're reaching for a new tube every time you need a new color. So let's go down into the basics and talk about how to use watercolor. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this dry brush and I'm going to wet it. Make sure it's good and wet. Remember that you cannot over wet watercolor. So I know in acrylic, I'm like, don't add too much water. With watercolor, you don't have to worry about that. So here's my brush. It's nice and wet. And I'm gonna choose a color. I'm gonna choose a color and I'm just gonna go right into it and just start wiping. This picks up paint and it mixes the water in my brush in with the paint. So I'm just gonna do this for a second. I want a nice heavy bit of this paint. And then I'm gonna come over to here and I'm gonna kind of roll my brush off, get off as much of that paint as possible. Now, just like any other kind of paint, watercolor can be thick or thin. So this is quite thick. If you can see that, the color is very dark. You can almost see a little bit of texture on the surface of it. This has a lot of pigment and not a lot of water. So if you don't want it quite that dark, you want a much thinner application of paint, just come over and dip into your water. And I'm gonna kind of mix it off to the side. So that's just the paint that was in my brush. Get some more. And now you can see that this is actually a much thinner version of the paint. It's not quite as thick as this one. You can tell because it kind of pulls itself back together into a rounded shape, where this one is more smeared. So that's one way you can tell a thicker paint from a thinner paint. Now there's two basic rules with watercolor. Paint applied to dry paper will stay where you put it. Paint applied to wet paper will move. So let's demonstrate that. I'm just using that purple. I'm gonna wet an area of my paper here. So that area is wet, this area is dry. So there's a lot of paint and water on this brush. And even if I put a ton of paint in here, it will only flow where the water is. So watch, if I tilt it, you can probably see the paint moving around a bit within that mark. But it's not going outside of that mark. It will only flow where there's water. So over here where I sprayed the paper, let's see what happens. See? Barely touching. And it's spreading. What happens if I make a line like that? The color is much softer and it moves. So remember that. When you're getting ready to put paint on your paper, ask yourself, do I want the paint to stay exactly where I put it, and do I want hard edges? Or do I want the paint to be soft and kind of do its own thing? That's going to determine if you work on wet or dry paper. Now there are different types of wet paper. There's different amounts of wetness, and it's really important that you're always aware of how wet your paper is. That will help you learn how to control the paint a little bit better. So I'm going to draw a couple of circles here. Let's do it that way. I'm gonna put a circle right here. They're probably not gonna be real even. And right here. And here. So as you can see here, I've labeled these, and we have domed, orange peel, drying, and dry. And these are the four basic states of the paper that I look for when I'm painting. So I'm just gonna take a clean brush with some water, and I'm gonna fill this one in. Just making it shiny. Just filling in that circle. Hopefully you can see the shine from the water on there. There, and as it's wet, you can see the texture of the paper a bit. Now in this one, I'm gonna add water to this circle as well. Maybe a little bit more water than I did on the last one. And on this one, I'm gonna put a lot of water. A lot of water in this one. Like it says, domed. That's what I'm going for. So see right there, you can start to see where it's smooth. Right there you can see texture. We want it all to be smooth. So I'm just gonna keep dripping some water in there. See how smooth that is. Over here, see how you can see the texture? That's what we call orange peel. It's like the texture of an orange. That's where your water is, your paper is wet, but it's not puddled. So orange peel is kind of a magical a magical place to be, and I will show you why. Now over here, as you can see, it's not shiny at all, but if I touch the paper, I can tell that it's a little bit damp, and I will show you what that is for as well. Over here, I didn't put any paper or any water on the paper. This is completely dry, and if you have these two side by side, you can definitely tell a difference. So what the domed water is good for, when your water is domed, let me show you that. I'm gonna mix up a little more of this purple. I'm gonna come over here and just drip into it. And it'll spread a little bit, but as you can tell, it kind of stops. It doesn't get going real far. Let's do this one before it dries too much. I'm gonna touch into it. This is that orange peel. And some colors spread better than others. I could have picked a color that spreads a little bit better, but as you can see, we've got much softer edges here. This gives us much harder edges. What the domed is good for is if you want to drip. So that's a lot of water. If I wanted, I could tilt it until that water drips and runs out. In fact, let's go ahead and do it right there. So if you want drips and runs, you want a lot of water that's kind of domed, very smooth looking when the light reflects on it. Orange peel, notice that's not moving anywhere. It's not gonna drip or run, but the paint spreads nicely. That's how you get those really pretty blooms. Now over here where it's drying, there's various stages of drying. It's pretty dry. It's not gonna do much of anything, but let's go ahead and paint this in, and we'll come back to it once it gets to where it's just not glossy anymore, because we do want to see what happens there. All right, so this is going to be our drying. Okay, dry paper is really good for crisp details. So let's take this little brush here. If I wanted to do crisp, fine details here, clearly I can't. It spreads, it bursts. Here, that's not gonna happen. But here, if I want very, very crisp little lines, I can get that here. That's how you want to know, or that's why you want to know when your paper is wet and how wet it is, or if it's dry, and honestly how dry it is. This is still a little bit shiny. I'm gonna let that dry for just a minute, and then I'll show you why I like to know when the paper is drying. Okay, so this is our drying circle, and as you can tell, it's mostly matte. It's not very shiny anymore. There's a couple of spots like right there that are a little bit shiny. But let me show you what happens here. I'm just gonna take a clean, damp brush, and I'm gonna run it through here. Just let that sit for a second. I'm gonna wipe my brush on a paper towel while I wait. And then I'm gonna come back with my dried off brush, and look at how it's lifting that paint. Just a little bit of water, and I can create some little blooms. Some little texture in here. Let that sit for a moment. Just kind of re-wets that paint, and then a dry, clean paper towel. I'm just gonna touch. I'm not pressing real hard. And see how it kind of lifts up some of that paint that I sprayed with the water. So you want to get to things like that before your paper is completely dry. Notice it didn't really lift over here because the paper is pretty dry over here. So I didn't get a lot of lifting, but over here where it's not quite as dry, I'm getting more lifting. And as you can tell, they all dry very differently. So the paint in the domed area, the pigments seem to settle into clusters a little bit more. You get some darker areas and some more very dispersed areas. We get harder edges. See, the edges of everything here is quite crisp and hard. The orange peel, the color disperses, and every paint color and paint brand is going to do it a little bit differently. So you want to experiment with the paints that you have, but orange peel is going to burst that color out a little bit more. You get a bit more of an even spread, very, very soft edges. When the paper is drying, but it's still just a little damp, that's when you can do some lifting and get some interesting little texture details. And when you paint on dry paper, you get very crisp edges, and the paint really doesn't change too much when it dries. Okay, now let's talk about some individual techniques. And the first one we're going to talk about is a wash. So I'm sure you've heard that term before, a wash of watercolor. Basically what a wash is just spreading water and paint across the surface. So I'm just using some water. I'm using my 5/8" filbert, but whatever size brush, whatever kind of big brush you have is good for a wash. It doesn't necessarily have to be orange peel, but you do want to make sure that it's not real, overly saturated and close to domed. You don't want the paint running around. So I'm just getting that same purple, and I'm just going to start running it across the paper. Now, one thing about a wash, I know a lot of people get frustrated with watercolor because you get like these brush marks like that, and so then they try and brush it out, but you just get more and more and more of them. Don't worry about that. It's part of the nature of watercolor, I think. So just leave it. But also what happens is as the paint dries, those lines kind of disperse and you'll get a really nice, pretty mottled effect. It won't necessarily be, like a brush stroke. It will just be areas that are a little lighter, areas that are a little bit darker. You can play with the wash and add other colors to it as well. So I'm just going to get a little bit of blue, and I'm going to kind of wash that in here too. Sometimes the colors resist each other. If you can see here where I added that blue, it kind of pushed the purple out of the way. But if you just kind of touch up into that purple and then back down into it, you can get things to mix. Try to avoid a whole lot of this. I think that as acrylic artists, we tend to want to really smooth everything out. But I think with watercolor, it ends up looking kind of strange. And the more you work it, the stranger it's going to look. But another thing is going to happen. You're going to start peeling the paper up. So just let the paint be what it wants to be. Usually when I do a wash, I'll push it around a little bit like that, but then just kind of touch. See how I'm just like touching the paper? Because I like those little mottled effects. I don't really want these overworked looking areas. So very light pressure and there, and then I might let it dry like that. Another thing you can do in a wash that I like to do because I like the variation is to come in with a clean, damp brush and just kind of touch into a few spots. Create some blooms. You can see those edges there. They're going to create what's called a back run. And a back run is where you get like a puddle of water here. This is domed water. See, it starts to move if I tilt it. So it creates what's called a back run. And back runs, some artists really hate them. I kind of like them. When the back run dries, remember just like here, how I said that the domed paint was going to have hard edges. this is domed, we're gonna get some hard edges in there. It's gonna be really interesting looking. So I'll set this aside and we can come back to it once it's dry. And a wash doesn't have to be this heavy of color. It can be very, very thin, lots of water, very little pigment to just give a suggestion of a color. Our next technique is drawing, and we've kind of already gone over that. But basically, drawing is done on dry paper. You can do it on wet paper. You're just gonna get a much softer look. But we can come in here and we can draw, you know, anything we like. Let's just kind of draw a goofy little face or something. And that paint is gonna stay right where I put it. That is supposed to be a nose. As you can tell, I don't do a whole lot of drawing. I'm not a real great drawer. Get a little mouth in there. Maybe some eyelashes. This is my super goofy person. Let's get some hair, some bangs or something. This person's getting worse and worse. But I think you get the point. We can draw on dry paper and get details that stay, even if those details look really bizarre and would frighten you if you saw them in your bedroom in the middle of the night. So that's drawing. The next one we're going to talk about is actually two, and that is bursting. We've done a little bit of it, but I'm going to show you something. I'm going to divide this into half. And we are going to, on one side, burst onto wet paper, and on the other side, we're going to burst into dry paper. Yes, you can burst on dry paper. Let's start with wet paper. I'm just going to go ahead and add some water to this. My clean water got purple, so it's a little purple. That's a little wet. That's not too bad. Just wipe a little bit of it off. Oh yeah, so if you need to get water off of your paper, notice what I'm doing here. I take my paper towel and I'm pinching the bristles and drying this brush off. Then I just wipe it over top of the paper, and that removes water. So let's go ahead. I'm gonna get a different color, a color that I know bursts really, really well. And I'm gonna just touch it to this wet paper. And look at it go. Look at that. This color bursts so beautifully. This is Cascade Green by Daniel Smith, and it's one of my favorites. I love how the color fractures too. If you can tell, it's got like a blue halo around it. It's such a beautiful color. But that's what I mean about the colors. Every color is going to do it differently. See the difference in the way the purple and the green fracture or do the burst. All right, let's do a burst on the dry side. So this paper is completely dry. And I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to apply it with flat pressure. So like that, see about the whole length the brush is touching, and drag that down. And as you can tell, it did not burst at all. I'm going to clean off my brush. So this brush is clean, it just has water in it. Again, I'm going to lay it flat, but I'm not touching the paint, see that? I'm just going to run it along right below it, and then I'm lightly going to go up and just, that was a bit dry, dang it. Here, let's add some more. There we go. My wet brush, come up and just touch, look at, that's how you can burst into dry paper. I love to do that technique. I do that a lot when I'm painting. So here, let me do another one, just kind of in a small area here. I'm gonna lay that paint down. It's dry. A damp brush. flat right below it, and then go up and just touch the edge of that paint and see how it pulls it in. And you can grab it and pull it across. That's how you get those really nice crisp top edges and really soft, blurry bottom edges, or vice versa, whatever you like. I think one thing I want to make sure that you understand is in watercolor, things are much more interesting if you have a variation in your edges. So what I mean by that is, if all of your painting is done on dry paper with these very crisp, hard edges, I think it's going to look very tight, very rigid, kind of uninteresting. I'm sure it can be done, you know, and look interesting, but I think it's going to be really challenging. Likewise, if you do everything on wet paper and everything is very burst and soft and blurry like this, the whole painting is just going to feel kind of melted and boring and uninteresting. I think the most interesting way to paint with watercolor is to have a combination of edges. So like this is going to be much more interesting, where we've got the sharp, crisp edge and then this soft, blurry edge. Have a combination of edges, which means working on both wet and dry paper, which goes back to always being aware of the state that your paper is in. Is it wet? And if so, how wet is it? What can you do on the paper at the stage of wetness that it is? All right, let's split this one in half again, because I want to talk about brushing versus bursting. So again, as acrylic artists, I think we have a tendency to brush, to, you know, really go back and forth. And I'm just going to spray down this whole paper. I want both sides wet. And my pen is probably going to smear. That's okay. Okay. So I'm going to get some more of my purple paint, and over here I'm going to brush the paint like I was showing you with the wash, how it looks. Let's say I want this whole thing to be purple, and I'm just going to brush it all across here. And you can definitely do that. You get, you know, some kind of obvious brush marks, but let's see what happens if we don't brush it. Instead, I'm going to just touching the paper. I might put a little pressure on it. My paper is, well, this color doesn't burst real well. I don't know why I keep picking that color thinking this time it's gonna burst, and it's not. So I'm gonna go back to my Cascade. This color bursts really nicely. See, I'm just kind of dabbing. It's just kind of touching and then letting the paint do what it wants to do. Clearly some colors you can do this easier with. That purple did not want to do that. It was not wanting to play my game, but this green really does. So sometimes I'll go flat like that to nudge it out, but then I like to go back to the tiptoe and just let the paint burst however it wants to. You can get some water and do a similar thing. Just let the paint move. So there's some bursting and there's some nudging, but what there isn't is a lot of brushing back and forth. And I think that that creates a much more interesting look to even the playing field. Let me add a little bit of this green on this side in the same way that I added it. So just kind of brushing it. I mean, it all really depends on what exactly the look is that you're going for. I prefer this kind of touch and burst method to the brushing. I feel the brushing makes it look kind of flat and boring. And we'll come back afterwards and see how these have both dried. Because one thing you also need to remember about watercolor is when it's dry, it's going to look different than when it's wet. Splattering. My favorite thing in the whole world is splattering. And you can really experiment with splattering so much. You can splatter on wet paper. I'm gonna wet down half of this paper. just 1/2 of it. Let's dry that off a bit. See, again, just wiping off some of that water so it's not quite so wet. All right, I'm gonna take a brush that I know is good at splattering. It's just my number 2 round. I'm gonna get some of that purple. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tap it with my finger. Just tap. And see, in the wet area, it bursts. You get these little bursts. In the dry area, you get these firm little spots that stay. So that's super fun. Another fun thing is to just splatter water. This is just plain water onto the paint and see how it kind of takes those and gives them some movement. Super fun to experiment with. And you can, if you want to get even more, come in here and just bang it on your finger a little bit. I don't think you can splatter too much. I love to splatter, as you can tell by my background here. It's been splattered on a ton. I do like to keep this little bright, this little number 8 bright for splattering. Experiment with different amounts of water. A thicker paint is going to give you more of a splatter, you know, like globs that are more irregularly shaped, where a lot of water is going to give you more speckles. And different brushes are going to give you different effects as well. So those are my 2 that I showed you. I like to splatter with the long liner too. You won't really be able to tell too much on here, but the long liner gives you an interesting, strangely, the long liner gives you more like drip type splatter than this brush did. Spend some time splattering and figuring out what brushes you like, what they all do, and how the splatters vary. I'm going to show you some more lifting. We kind of talked about lifting already on here with the drying paper, but that's not all that lifting is. So I'm going to do just a quick wash of this purple. Let's throw a couple other colors in there. My paint water is just all over the place at this point, so typically I try to keep them both really, you know, separate from each other, but I get talking and not paying attention. And okay, so there's a lot of paint on there, just a lot going on. Now what I'm going to do is I've cleaned my brush. I'm going to dry it on my paper towel as good as I can. You don't want to use a purely dry brush, so I'm not going to grab another brush that's completely dry. It's not going to work as well. You want it to be ever so slightly damp, but paper towel dry. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go clear down to the paper and just wipe. Wash my brush off, dry it on my paper towel. See, and I can get some nice light areas. And because this paper is still wet, they will dry with softer edges. It might creep back in just a little bit. Keep in mind that some paint colors are gonna lift a lot easier than others. Some paint colors aren't gonna lift at all. If you need a little more lifting than what you're getting, just drop a little bit of water on there. I just put a little dribble of water. Dry my brush again and wipe and see how much cleaner that spot is now. Just remember, again, you don't want to go over it and over it and over and over and over it. Give it a couple little wipes gently and be done with it. The more you go over it, you're going to start peeling that paper up and getting kind of shreddy spots. And the cheaper your paper is, the quicker that's going to happen. And this is not terribly expensive paper, so I can very easily dig down into that too much and shred it up. But look at how pretty that is, just from very simply wiping away some paint. Now, another thing you can do, and I'm just going to do it on this one, is water resisting and blooms. And we've already done a little bit of that, but I want to show you on here. So it's nice and dark here. It's still wet. It's very shiny. Just some water. I'm going to come over here and just touch. And you can see how it starts to bloom, and as it dries, that will change. Now to go back to our splattering, I'm going to do that here too with just water. And look at that. I did that on a couple of my paintings in my 60 and 30 in the space scenes. I just splattered some water, and it was really effective in making it look like space, I thought. That's just water. Again, you do have to be really aware of where your paint, where the moisture level of your paper is. Right here, this is almost domed. And so if you notice when I splatter there, nothing happens because it's too thick there. But over here where it's orange peel, I'm getting those nice little bursts. So we'll let this dry and come back to it and see what it looks like. Just using this old piece of paper that we already used once to show you this next technique. This is running a clean wet brush through wet paint. So basically painting with water and no paint. So I'm gonna lay down some paint here. Just some paint. Maybe we'll throw a little more in there so it's nice and dark. Okay, and that's pretty wet. It's about domed. We could even wait until that's closer to orange peel. In fact, maybe I'll just take some of that out. So if it's too wet, you know, just barely touch it. Try to only touch the paint. Where you touch the paper is where it removes a lot of the paint and you get those white spots. So here I'm trying my hardest to just touch the paint. And notice I'm drying off my brush every little bit. Get this closer to orange peel. There we go. Now I'm going to take my long liner, and it's just a little bit damp, that's it. And I'm going to start drawing in here. I'm going to start in the paint and just flick out and see how the paint follows that. So rather than, you know, painting a bunch of like really stark looking trees, just get some water and, you know, then you can get some ghostly looking trees that seem a bit more distant, or grasses, or whatever it is. Just using water here. See how the paint follows it up there as you draw it. You can even come in and just get a little bit of blue right here at the bottom. And if your paint is wet enough, the right amount of wet, it will follow those brush strokes that you just did. I'm just kind of dribbling a little bit of this dark blue into some of those brush marks. That's a really good way to get some texture and some drawing without adding more paint or, you know, changing the colors that you have in any way. And our last technique that we're going to talk about right now is palette knife. So I told you I would show you some palette knife, and here we go. Now you can do an entire painting with watercolor with nothing but a palette knife. The important thing to remember when using a palette knife with watercolor is pressure. You do not want to put pressure on the knife and scrape the paper, because again, it will rip that paper up, and I will do that. I'll show you what too much pressure looks like. Here is the amount of pressure that you should put on the palette knife when painting with watercolor. That's the pressure that you should put. Do you see that? it's just the weight of the knife. I am not pushing the knife down into the paper at all. Any more than that, and you're really gonna start to rip up the paper. So let me show you how I like to use the palette knife. I'm going to get some paint on my brush. Mr. Moon says hi. And then I'm gonna scoop up as much of that paint as I can with my brush, and I'm gonna scrape it onto the back of my knife. Or you can you see that there down here in the corner? Just kind of wipe the knife into that little pile of paint. So I've got a bunch of paint there on my knife. And then I'm gonna come, again, I'm not pressing, I'm just placing the flat part of the knife onto the paper. And look at that cool texture and shape that I get. You can't get that with a brush. You can even dip it into your water, just coming in with a wet knife. And I'm gonna create a little bit of a bloom by just pulling some water across the bottom edge there. If you want some trees or something, again, I just scraped up a little bit of that. I'm not scraping, again, it's just the weight of the knife. That's all. I'm not pressing down, just a little water. Nudge some bits out. Gives you some really creepy looking little lines. That's how you get some creepy trees. You want creepy trees with watercolor? Do it with a palette knife. Another thing you can do, I'm going to use a brush for this part. I'm going to lay some paint down here, get a little bit of water. Let's carve a path in there. So I'm going to clean off my knife and just wipe it on a paper towel so it's dry. It's going to look like I'm scraping, but again, it's really just the weight of the knife, okay? I'm going to use the edge, and I'm just going to pull. Wipe it off. Just let it give you the amount of texture that it's going to give you. We can even, kind of carve in trees. Let's do that real quick. Just get a nice area of some paint and water there. Clean palette knife, again, I'm gonna use the edge, and I'm just gonna kind of pull to one side. This is pretty wet. I might wanna wait until this is a little bit drier. But this is a good way to start carving in some trees and, you know, just getting an idea of where they are, or even just suggesting trees, or building, whatever you want, just building some texture. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when you do it too much, so you know what to look for. It already kind of started there. I started scraping it quite a bit. Okay, I'm going to scrape it too hard. I'm going to put some pressure on it. And immediately you can see what's happening. It might not look that bad to you, but you see these kind of crumply looking bits there that look a little darker. That's the paper starting to break up. And you can hear the pressure that I'm putting on there. And that, yeah, it's starting to get little rolly balls of the paper coming up. Can you see that? These little bits. It's shredding up the paper. And it doesn't look good. And it's not good. So don't scrape it too much. When you're doing it this way, all it takes is, you know, just a drag. But if you're like really pushing and digging like that, you're gonna cut into the paper. Let's see if you can see it on the back. You probably can't see it, but I can even feel it. The paper is very delicate. It doesn't like a lot of abuse. So be very gentle with the palette knife. Sit down with a few sheets of paper and just do everything you can think of with the palette knife so that you can get a feel for what is too much, what is enough, and what it can do. All right, let's talk about the mediums that I'm using now. And again, my mediums are water, rubbing alcohol, salt water, and granulation medium. And I'm gonna pick a color that I know will work good with all of these. I can't stress that enough, you guys. You want to play with your paints so that you know which color does what. They all are a little bit different. I'm just gonna wet this down quickly. And notice my water got purple. Don't do what I did. Do what I say. I told you not to wash in both buckets, and then I did. Okay, so I'm gonna go with that Cascade green again. Such a pretty color. We get nice, good blooms. Let's just start with that. I'm gonna show you, I kind of already showed you what water does. And this is why I have this bigger bottle. Very lightly spray it. I can get those little speckles. Likewise, I'm going to add some more of that same color right here. And I'm going to show you what happens with rubbing alcohol. So I'm very lightly going to spray it so it's more of a splatter. And look at that. The rubbing alcohol resists it, pushes it out of the way, and you get this super interesting texture. I love what rubbing alcohol does to paint. Next, let's try salt water. I don't really know what the salt water is going to do, if anything. So let's see. Oh, there we go. So it resisted the paint, which I expected, just like regular water did. But we'll come back to it once it's dry, and we'll see if they dried different, if they look different from the salt crystals. Now the last one is granulation medium. So I'm going to take some of this Cascade, put it along there. My granulation medium. And I have a little pipette. You can use a brush or whatever you want. I'm just gonna get a couple drops. I'm just gonna drop 1, 2, 3 drops. And the granulation medium works better. I can already see it working, but it works better if you move the paint, move the paper around a little bit so that it can flow. Let it flow a little bit. The more it moves around, the more it can granulate. So see here how it looks grainy and kind of gritty. That's what the granulation medium does. It makes the paint kind of separate so you get this really textural look, and that can be so much fun to play with. As you can see in the other areas, that paint doesn't really have that. You don't see any of that sandy effect in this paint, but there's a lot of it right there. Super fun. Some paints do that a lot. Some paints granulate a ton. Some paints granulate not at all. So again, you want to just kind of experiment with them and see which is which and what they do. Now, like I said, there's 1,000 different mediums that you can use for watercolor. These are the only ones that I have any experience with. And I don't use a lot of mediums outside of water, but read up on them. And if there's one that sounds interesting and sounds like it might be something that you would like in your painting, then try that one and see what it does. Okay, let's go over some of our samples and see how they have changed as they've dried. So here's our wash, the first one that we did. And as I said, where it had the brush marks and everything. It's just a little mottled. It's really interesting looking. Here's where we did the back run, which was where I added some water and it kind of bloomed, and see how it's got the harder edge. I like back runs. Some people don't like them. There's not a right and wrong. You either like them or you don't. But that's what a wash looks like when it's dry, and that's what a back run looks like. Here we have brushing the paint on versus letting it kind of bloom and do its own thing. And in my opinion, this side is more dynamic and exciting. The back run is a little aggressive right there, but the way the paint colors are kind of mottled together, and we've got areas that are a little heavier and areas that are a little lighter, that's more appealing to me than this side that's just very smooth, and it just seems very kind of flat and boring to me. But again, it is going to depend on what it is that you're painting, what kind of a look that you're going for. But this is just to show you that blending looks totally different than just kind of dabbing and letting the colors bloom together. Our splatters are pretty dry, and we have some really interesting textures and effects going on in there. We splattered with several different brushes on wet paper and on dry paper, and then we even splattered just clear water on top of paint splatters. And I think that that's really fun. It's a really nice effect, especially if you're painting a little bit larger and maybe you're painting rocks or sand, like a desert ground. This could be a really interesting technique to get some fun, rocky, pebbly texture that way. Here is where I did some lifting. And remember I said that that would dry with softer edges, and it certainly did. Not only did we do lifting on this, but we did some water resist. I just splattered just clear water on orange peel paper, and that's where we get these little pale bursts. Super, super easy, and this almost looks like a completed space painting, and it was just very quick. No effort into that at all. So boom, right there. You now know how to do space paintings. Let it dry completely, splatter some white gouache on it for stars, and you're done. And this is getting dry. It's still pretty wet right there, but that's fine. You can see how much that granulated and how sandy that looks. Super pretty. Over here, that water with this paint, because it kind of forms like a mossy texture anyway, we got some really interesting textures in there. That's gorgeous. The rubbing alcohol is a nice kind of pebbly texture again. And over here, the salt water, it actually looks pretty similar to the regular water, but the edges that are dry seem just a little bit more crinkly, where over here they're a little bit softer. So that's kind of fun. I think I want to experiment with salt water. Okay, now cleanup. Cleanup is very easy. Here's your palette. I typically don't clean up my palette after I'm done. I wait until the next time, but you know, whatever, it's easy either way. This paper towel is pretty wet. I'm just gonna go ahead and start wiping it. I can spray it with a little bit of water if I need. And once I've cleaned my palette, I typically let the paint sit open while it dries, partially so they don't drip into each other. Sometimes if you close it and there's puddles of water, they can drip into the ones opposite, but also just to avoid the possibility of mold. I doubt that with palettes like this, because they're pretty airy, they've got these holes, I doubt there's much chance for mold, but just to be on the safe side. So I would usually just let that sit like that, and then when it's dry, then I would go ahead and close it. Next, we would clean our brushes, and I'd got 1 bucket of clean water to demonstrate cleaning the brushes. So I'm going to start in the dirty water, wipe it through there, dry it off really good on my paper towel, checking to see how much pigment was left, and it really didn't leave any. So I'm going to go ahead into the clean water, pressing the brush flat. Never stab your brush. Don't do that. That will destroy your brush. And pressing it flat to the bottom and then wiping it. That's how we clean brushes, whether it's acrylic, oil, watercolor, whatever. Don't stab. Pull that out. dry it on the paper towel again checking for pigment. Now here's the fun thing about watercolor. Unlike acrylic or oil, if you let paint dry in your brush, it is not ruined. Look at that. This brush is hard because I completely let paint dry in this brush. So I went into the water. I don't know if you can see, kind of turn the water a little bit green, dry it off. And this brush is good as new. Once you've dried them, just reshape them, lay them flat on a paper towel to dry. Never stand wet brushes up because the water will pool down into the ferrule and destroy the brush. Leave your brushes laying flat until they're dry and then put them in the cup. One last thing, I wanted to show you how to take the paper off of these blocks. And then I'm going to show you a quick way that you can test out your colors so that you can get to know them. So again, I'm just finding where there's no glue, sticking the palette knife in there, and it doesn't take very much pressure at all. Just gently pull and it will cut right through that glue, go all the way around. I don't like to come at any point and pull the paper off because it can tear and deform the paper. So I just go with my palette knife all the way around, just like that. And now I can set that aside and I can use this one. So before we finish this, I'm going to show you just a quick way that you can test your colors. So I'm going to grab a brush. I'm going to make a rectangle here. First, I want to test out how well the color blooms. Because remember, as you saw, not all of the colors bloom. I'm just painting a little rectangle. I want it as close to orange peel as possible. I'm going to get this other green, serpentine green. And I'm going to paint it in down here. And then just kind of dot it through here. Let it do its thing. I'm not going to fill in this whole square. I'm just going to dot the color, see what it does. Now I'm going to mix up a heavy concentration of the color. We'll put it over here so you can see that. It's very thick. This has a little bit of texture to it, like I showed you at the beginning. And right here on dry paper, I'm going to see what that color looks like at about full concentration. Picked up some water, add to that so it's a little bit thinner. I'm going to do it again. A little more water. More water. Just so I can see all the variations of the color. Next, I want to test out how it resists with just water. So kind of the little, like when I was splattering and I got the little frosty look. Oh, there's cat hair. That's always helpful. So we'll just get some of that color in there. Over here, we'll let that sit for a minute. Over here, I want to test out how well it lifts because some colors don't lift very well. They're much more staining. All right. Just some clean water. I'm going to drip it right into the center of that square. Maybe one more drip. We'll see what happens there. I'm going to dry that off on a paper towel. And I'm going to lift in here. So if you do something similar to this, test out any properties of the paint you like, but do something like this with all of the colors that you have and you'll start to really get to know them. You can even label it and keep it with your paints so that if you think, oh, what does serpentine green look like again? Here's a good example of what serpentine green looks like. Taking the time to do something like this is a lot better than thinking, oh, I want serpentine green, and you grab it and you put it on your painting only to find out that that is not the color that you want. And the way it fractures and changes like this goes against what it is that you're trying to paint. Take the time to do this so that you can make educated decisions when you're going to choose your colors. So that is everything that you need to know to get started painting with watercolor. From here, I just want you to gather your materials and start experimenting. Experiment with the techniques that I've shown you. Just do all kinds of tests and color mixing and anything you can think of. Right now, I do not want you to pressure yourself to sit down and make a painting. That's why I didn't show you a painting in this one. I want you to get to know your materials, figure out what it does, because only once you see firsthand what the material does on its own can you learn how to control it. And you will learn how to control it so much faster than you think you will if you just give into it and explore it and play with it and see what happens. Now I'm gonna go because next up I need to make a watercolor tutorial for you, an actual tutorial where we'll sit down and do some real techniques and see how we can apply all of the things that we've learned today into a painting. So let me know if you have any other questions that I didn't cover for you here, and I'll see if I can address them either in the comments or in a future video. And I hope to see you all again very, very soon.